The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. The Earling. The day of the Earling was a day of rain. Monotonous, sullen, grey rain with no life in it. It had not even the power to stop. There were always 100 heads at the windows of the north wing that stared into the sky, into the rain. 100 figures leant across the sills of the southern wall and stared. They would disappear back into the darkness, one by one, but others would have appeared at other windows. There would always be about 100 starers. Rain. The slow rain. The east and the west of the castle watched the rain. It was to be a day of rain. There could be no stopping it. Even before the dawn, hours before, when the grey scrubbers were polishing the walls of the stone kitchen and the raft makers were putting the finishing touches to the raft of chestnut boughs, and the stable boys, by the light of lanterns, were grooming the horses, it was obvious that there was a change in the castle. It was the greatest day, and it rained. It was obvious, this change, in many ways, most superficially of all, in the visual realm, for all wore sacking. Every mortal one. Sacking died in the hot blood of eagles. On this day there would be no one save Titus, exempt from the immemorial decree, that the castle shall wear sacking on the Earling day. Steerpike had officiated at the distribution of the garments under the direction of Barquentine. He was getting to know a great deal about the more obscure and legendary rites. It was in his mind to find himself on Barquentine's decease the leading, if not the sole authority, in matters of ritual and observance. In any event, the subject fascinated him. It was potential. Curse, he muttered as he woke to the sound of rain. But still, what did it matter? It was the future that he had his eyes on. A year ahead, 5 years ahead. In the meantime, all aboard for glory. Mrs. Slagg was up early and had put on her sacking garment on at once in deference to the sacrosanct convention. It was a pity that she could not wear her hat with the glass grapes, but of course, on the day of the Earling, no one wore hats. A servant had brought in the night before the stone which Titus was to hold in his left hand, the ivy branch which he was to carry in his right, and the necklace of snail shells for his little neck. He was still asleep, and Nanny was ironing the white linen smock which would reach his ankles. It was blanched to a quality as of white light. Nanny fingered it as though it were gossamer. "So it's come to this," Nanny was talking to herself. "So it's come to this. The tiniest thing in the world to be an earl today. Today! Oh, my weak heart, how cruel they are to make a tiny thing have such responsibility. Cruel, cruel. It isn't righteousness. No, it isn't. But he is the Earl, the naughty mite. The only one, and no one can say he isn't. Oh, my poor heart, they've never been to see him. It's only now they want to see him because the day has come." Her miniature screwed-up face was skirmishing with tears. Her mouth worked itself in and out of its own dry wrinkles between every sentence. "They expect him to come, the new Earl, for their homage and everything. But it's me who baths him and gets him ready, and irons out his white smock and gives him his breakfast. But they won't think of all that. And then... Nanny suddenly sat down on the edge of the chair and began to cry. "They'll take him away from me. Oh, justlessness. And I'll be all alone to die, and I'll be with you, said Fuchsia from the door. "And they won't take him away from you. Of course they won't." Nanny Slag ran up to her and clung to her arm. "They will," she cried. "Your huge mother said she would. She said she would." "Well, they haven't taken me away, have they?" said Fuchsia. "But you're only a girl," cried Nanny Slag, louder than ever. "You won't matter. You're not going to be anything." Fuchsia dislodged the old woman's hand and walked heavily to the window. The rain poured down. It poured down. The voice behind her went on. "As though I haven't poured my love out every day. Every day. I've poured it all away until I'm hollowed out. It's always me. It always has been. Toil after toil. Moil after moil, with no one to say, 'God bless you,' no one to understand." Fuchsia could stand it no longer. Much as she loved her nurse, she could not hear that melancholy, peevish voice and watch the doleful rain and keep herself calm. Unless she left the room, she would break something, the nearest breakable thing. She turned and ran, and in her own room once more fell upon the bed, the skirt of a sacking costume rucked up about her thighs. Of the castle's countless breakfasts that dark morning there were few that tasted well. The steady monotone of the pattering rain was depressing enough, but for it to descend on such a day was sheer gloom. It was as though it defied the castle's inmost faith, taunted it with a dull, ignorant descent of blasphemy, as though the undrainable clouds were muttering, "What is an Earling to us? It's immaterial." It was well that there was much to do before the hour of 12, and there were few who were not occupied with some task or another relevant to the day. The great kitchen was in an uproar of activity before 8 o'clock had struck. The new chef was in great contrast to the old, a bow-legged, mule-faced veteran of the ovens, with a mouthful of brass teeth and tough, dirty grey hair. His head appeared to sprout the stuff rather than grow it. There was something ferocious about it. In the kitchen it was said that he had his head cropped every other day. Indeed, there were some who held that they had seen it on the move at the speed of the minute hand of a great clock. Out of this mule face, and from between the glintings of his teeth, a slow, resonant voice would make its way from time to time. But he was not communicative, and for the most part gave his orders by means of gesturing with his heavy hands. The activities in the great kitchen, where everything relating to the preparation of food in all its aspects seemed to be going on at the same moment, and where the heat was beginning to make the stone halls sweat, were not in fact being pursued in readiness for this day of Earling, but for the morrow. For, alongside the sartorial beggary went a mendicant's diet, the figures of sacking having only crusts to eat until the next day dawned, when, once more in their own clothes, the symbolic humility in the presence of the new Earl of Gormenghast over, they were able to indulge in a barbecue that rivalled that on the day of Titus's birth. The kitchen staff, man and boy, and the entire servantage in all its forms and both its sexes were to be ready at 11:30 to troop down to Gormenghast Lake, where the trees would be in readiness for them. The carpenters had been working at the lakeside and among the branches for the last 3 days. In the cedars had been erected the wooden platforms, which had for 22 years been leaning against a midnight wall in the depths of the ale vaults. Strangely shaped areas of battened planking, like fragments from an immense jigsaw pattern. They had to be strengthened, for 22 years in the unhealthy cellars had not improved them, and they had, of course, to be repainted white. Each weirdly outlined platform was so shaped that it might fit perfectly in place among the cedar branches. The varying eccentricities of the trees had many hundreds of years ago been the subject of careful study, so that at all the future Earlings the stages, so ingeniously devised, might be slipped into place with the minimum of difficulty. On the back of each wooden stage was written the name of the tree for which it was constructed, and the height of the platform from the ground, so that there would be no confusion. There were 4 of these wooden inventions, and they were now in place. The 4 cedars to which they belonged were all thigh-deep in the lake, and against the great boles of these trees ladders were erected which sloped across the shallow water from the shore to a foot or so below the level of the platforms. Similar but ruder structures were wedged in among the branches of ash and beech, and where possible among the closely growing larches and pines. On the opposite side of the lake, where the aunts had paddled from the sand to the dripping steerpike, the trees were set too far back from the water's edge to afford the necessary vantage. But in the densely wooded hanger were 1,000 boughs, among the convolutions of which the menials could find themselves some kind of purchase or another. A yew tree in a clearing, rather farther back from the water than the rest of the inhabited trees, had the wedge-faced poet as its guest. The great piece had been torn from its side, and in the cleft the rain bubbled, and the naked flesh of the tree was crimson. The rain fell almost vertically in the breathless air, stippling the grey lake. It was as though its white glass texture of yesterday was now composed of a different substance, of grey sandpaper, a vast granulated sheet of it. The platforms ran with films of the rain. The leaves dripped and splashed in the films. The sand on the opposite shore was sodden. The castle was too far to be seen through the veil of endless water. There was no individual cloud to be seen. It was a grey sky, unbroken, from which the melancholy strings descended. The day drew on, minute after raining minute, hour after raining hour, until the trees of the steep hanger were filled with figures. They were to be found on practically every branch that was strong enough to support them. A great oak was filled with the kitchen staff, a beech with the gardeners, Pentecost sitting majestically in the main dividing fork of the slippery trunk. The stable lads were perching themselves precariously among the branches of a dead walnut, and, cat-calling and whistling, were pulling each other's hair at every opportunity, or kicking out with their feet. For every tree or group of trees, its trade or status. Only a few officials moved about at the water's edge, awaiting the arrival of the principal figures. Only a few officials among the trees, but on the further shore and along the strip of dark sand there was gathered a great congregation. It stood in complete silence. Old men, old women, and clusters of strange striplings. There was about them a complete silence. They were apart. They were the mud-dwellers, the denizens of the outer wall, the forgotten people, the bright carvers. There was a woman by the shore. She stood a little apart from a group. Her face was young, and it was old, the structure youthful, the expression broken by time. The bane of the dwellers. In her arms was an infant with flesh like alabaster. The rain came down on all. It was warm rain, warm melancholy and perpetual. It laved the little alabaster body of the child, and still it laved it. There was no ending, and the great lake swelled. In the high branches of the dead walnut tree the whistling and scuffling had ceased, for horses were moving through the conifers of the adjacent shore. They had reached the water's edge and were being tethered to the low sweeping arms of the cedars. On the first horse, a great grey hunter by any normal standard, was seated, side-saddled, the Countess. She had been hidden among leaves, only the horse showing itself. But immediately she became exposed to view, her mount became a pony. The symbolic sacking hung about her in vast, dripping folds. Behind her, a roan bore Fuchsia, with her legs astride. She was patting its neck as she came through the trees. It was like patting soaked velvet. Its black mane was like a repetition of Fuchsia's hair. Lank with rain, it clung to the forehead and the throat. The aunts were in a pony trap. That they were not in purple seemed extraordinary. Their dresses had always been as ingenious and inevitable a part of them as their faces. They seemed uncomfortable in the sacking and kept plucking at it with their limp hands. The thin man who led the pony brought it to a halt at the lakeside, and at the same moment another trap of similar design, but painted a dark and unpleasant orange, trundled through the pines, and there was Mrs. Slagg, sitting as upright as she could, her proud attitude, as she supposed it, nullified by the terrified look of her face, which protruded like some kind of wizened fruit from the coarse folds of the garment. She could remember the Earling of Sepulcrave. He had been in his teens. He had swum out to the raft, and there had been no rain. But, oh, her poor heart, this was so different. It would never have rained at an Earling when she was a young girl. Things were so different then. On her lap was Titus, drenched. Even so, the smock she had been so carefully ironing looked miraculously white, as though it gave forth light instead of receiving it. He sucked his thumb as he stared about him. He saw the figures peering down at him from the trees. He did not smile. He simply stared, turning his face from one to another. Then he became interested in a golden bangle which the Countess had sent him the same morning, pulling it as far up his arm as he could, then down to his plump, wrinkled wrist, studying it seriously all the while. The doctor and his sister had a sycamore to themselves. Irma took some time being hoisted, and was not at all happy about the whole business. She disliked having her hips wedged between rough branches, even in the cause of symbolism. The doctor, seated a little above her, looked like some form of bird, possibly a plucked crane. Steerpike had followed Nanny Slagg in order to impress the crowd. Although he should have been in a pine for 4, he now selected a small ash where he could both be seen and could see with equal advantage to himself and the rest of Gormenghast. The twins were keeping their mouths tightly shut. They repeated to themselves every thought as it occurred to them, to find whether the word fire could possibly have crept into it, and when they found it hadn't, they decided in any event to keep it to themselves in order to be on the safe side. Thus it was that they had not spoken a word since Steerpike left them in their bedroom. They were still white, but not so horribly so. The breath of a yellow reflection had infiltrated itself into their skin, and this was nasty enough. Nothing could have been more truly spoke than when Steerpike, as death, had cried that he would be forever with them. They held each other tightly as they waited to be helped from the trap, for death had not left them since that curdling night, and his livid skull was before their eyes. By well-proportioned mixtures of brute strength and obsequious delicacy, the officials had at last established the Countess Gertrude upon her stage in the enormous, swarthy boughs of the cedar tree. A red carpet had been spread over the woodwork of the platform. The waders and lakeside birds of many breeds which had been disturbed by the activities of the day, after flying distractedly hither and thither over the forest in swarms, had, as soon as the Countess was seated in the enormous wicker-work chair, flocked to her tree in which they settled, angling and disputing for positions at her feet, and over various parts of her accommodating body were a whitethroat, a fieldfare, a willow wren, a nuthatch, a tree pipit, a sand martin, a red-backed shrike, a goldfinch, a yellow bunting, 2 jays, a great spotted woodpecker, 3 moorhens, on her lap with a mallard, a woodcock, and a curlew, a wagtail, 4 missel thrushes, 6 blackbirds, a nightingale, and 27 sparrows. They fluttered themselves, sending sprays of varying dimensions according to their wingspans through the dripping air. There was more shelter beneath the cedars, with their great outstretched hands spread one above the other in dark green dripping terraces, than was the case for those in alternative vegetation. At this extreme, the stable boys in the top branches of the walnut might as well have been sitting in the lake. They could not have been wetter. It was the same for the dwellers on the shore, that proud, impoverished congregation. They cast no reflection in the water at their feet. It was too triturated by the pricking of the rain. Getting Barquentine established on his stage was the trickiest and most unpleasant task which fell to the lot of the officials. It took place to the accompaniment of such hideous swearing as caused his withered leg to blush beneath the sacking. It must have been hardened by many years of oaths, but this morning an awakened sense of shame at what the upper part of the body could descend to rattled it from hip to toe. Its only consolation was that the contaminating influence had not descended lower than the lungs, and what diseases the withered leg experienced were entirely physical. When he was seated at the high-backed Earling chair, he pushed his crutch irritably beneath it, and then began to wring out his beard. Fuchsia was by now in her cedar. She had one to herself, and it was comparatively dry, a thick foliage spreading immediately above the stage, and she was gazing across the water at the dwellers. What was it about them that quickened her, those people of the outer wall? Why did she feel ill at ease? It was as though they held a dark secret, of which one day they would make use, something which would jeopardize the security of the castle. But they were powerless. They depended upon the grace of Gormenghast. What could they do? Fuchsia noticed a woman standing a little apart from a group. Her feet were in the lake. In her arms she held a child. It seemed, as Fuchsia watched, that she could see for a quick moment the dark strands of rain through the limbs of the child. She rubbed her eyes, and again she stared. It was too far. She could not tell. Even the officials had climbed into the ivy-throttled elm with its broken limb that hung by a sapless tendon. The aunts on the 4th of the cedar stages shivered, their mouths tightly closed. Death sat with them, and they could not concentrate on the procedure. Barquentine had started, his old voice grating its way through the warm downpour. It could be heard everywhere, for no one noticed the sound of the rain anymore. It had been so monotonous for so long that it had become inaudible. Had it stopped suddenly, the silence would have been like a blow. Steerpike was watching Fuchsia through the branches. She would be difficult, but it was only a matter of careful planning. He must not hurry it. Step by step. He knew her temperament. Simple, painfully simple, inclined to be passionate over ridiculous things, headstrong, but a girl nonetheless, and easy to frighten or to flatter, absurdly loyal to the few friends she had, but mistrust could always be sown quite easily. Oh, so painfully simple. That was the crux of it. There was Titus, of course, but what were problems for if not to be solved. He sucked at his hollow tooth. Prune Squalor had wiped his glasses for the 20th time and was watching Steerpike, watching Fuchsia. He was not listening to Barquentine, who was rattling off the catechismic monody as fast as he could, for he was suffering the first twinges of rheumatism.
"And will forever hold in sacred trust the castle of his fathers and the domain adhering thereto. That he will in letter and in spirit defend it in every way against the incursions of alien worlds. That he will observe its sacred rites, honour its crest, and in due time instill into the first male of his loins reverence for its every stone, until his fathers he has added in the tomb his link to the unending chain of groans. So be it."
Barquentine wiped the water from his face with the flat of his hand and wrung out his beard again. Then he fumbled for his crutch and hoisted himself onto his leg. With his free arm he pushed aside a branch and screamed down through the branches,
"Are you skulks ready?"
The two raftmen were ready. They had taken Titus from Nanny's slag and were standing on the raft of chestnut boughs at the lake's edge. Titus was sitting at their feet in the middle of the raft, the size of a doll. His sepia hair was stuck to his face and neck. His violet eyes were a little startled. His white smock clung to him so that the form of his little body was divulged. The clinging cloth was luminous.
"Push off, curse you! Push off!"
yelled Barquentine. His voice raked the water's surface east to west. With a long, gradual shoving of their poles, the two men propelled the raft into deeper water. Moving up either side of the raft and plunging their poles a dozen or so times brought them near the centre of the lake. In a leather bag hung at his waist, the older of the two raftmen had the symbolic stone, ivy branch, and necklace of snail shells. The water was now too deep for them to strike bottom, and they dived over the side and, turning, clasped the edge of the raft. Then, striking out, frog-like with their legs, they had soon brought the raft to the approximate position.
"More to the west!"
screamed Barquentine from the shore.
"More to the west, idiots!"
The swimmers splashed themselves around to the adjacent edge of the raft and once more began to kick out. Then they lifted their heads from the rain-prodded water and stared in the direction of Barquentine's voice.
"Hold!"
yelled the unpleasant voice.
"And bide your damn selves!"
The two men worked their way around until their heads were very nearly obscured by the thick chestnut rim of the raft on the far side from the trees. With only their faces bobbing above the surface, they trod water. Titus was alone. He stared about him, bewildered. Where was everybody? The rain streamed over him. His features began to pucker and his lips to tremble, and he was about to burst into tears when he changed his mind and decided to stand up instead. The raft had become quite still, and he kept his balance. Barquentine grunted to himself. This was good. Ideally speaking, the prospective Earl should be on his feet while being named. In the case of Titus, this tenet would naturally have had to be waived if the infant had decided to keep seated or to crawl about.
"Titus Groan!"
cried the ancient voice from the shore.
"The day has come! The castle awaits your sovereignty! From horizon to horizon, all is yours, to hold in trust, animal, vegetable, and mineral. Time without end, save for your single death that cannot stem a tide of such illustrious blood."
This was the raftsman's cue, and clambering over the side, they placed the necklace of snails around the little wet neck, and as the voice from the shore cried,
"Now!"
attempted to place in Titus's hands the stone and the ivy branch. But he would not hold them.
"Hell's blood and gallstones!"
screamed Barquentine.
"What's the matter? Rot your hides! What's the matter? Give him his stone and ivy, curse you!"
He opened his little fingers with difficulty and placed the symbols against his palms, but he snatched his hands away from them. He would not hold the things. Barquentine was beside himself. It was as though the child had a mind of its own. He smote the stage with his crutch and spat with fury. There was not one either among the dripping trees or along the strip of bubbling sand. Not one whose eyes were not fixed on Titus. The men on the raft were helpless.
"Fools, fools, fools!"
came the hideous voice through the rain.
"Leave them at his feet, curse your black guts! Leave them at his feet! Oh, body of me, take your damned heads away!"
The two men slipped back into the water, cursing the old man. They had left the stone and the ivy branch on the raft at the child's feet. Barquentine knew that the Earling was to be completed by noon. It was decreed in the old tomes and was law. There was barely a minute to go. He swung his bearded head to left and right.
"Your ladyship, the Countess Gertrude of Gormenghast! Your ladyship, Fuchsia of Gormenghast! Their ladyships, Cora and Clarice Groan of Gormenghast! Arise!"
Barquentine crushed himself forward on the slippery stage until he was within a few inches of the edge. There was no time to lose.
"Gormenghast will now watch and listen. It is the moment."
He cleared his throat and began and could not stop, for there was no time left. But as he cried the traditional words, his fingernails were splintering into the oak wood of his crutch, and his face had become purple. The huge beads of sweat on his brow were lilac, for the colour of his congested head burned through them.
"In the sight of all, in the sight of the castle's southern wing, in the sight of Gormenghast Mountain, and in the sacred sight of your forefathers of the blood, I, Warden of the Immemorial Rights, proclaim you on this day of Earling to be the Earl, the only legitimate Earl between heaven and earth, from skyline to skyline. Titus, the 77th Lord of Gormenghast."
A hush most terrible and unearthly had spread and settled over the lake, over the woods and towers, and over the world. Stillness had come like a shock, and now that the shock was dying, only the white emptiness of silence remained. For while the concluding words were being cried in a black anger, two things had occurred. The rain had ceased, and Titus had sunk to his knees and had begun to crawl to the raft's edge, with a stone in one hand and an ivy branch in the other. And then, to the horror of all, had dropped the sacrosanct symbols into the depths of the lake. In the brittle, pricking silence that followed, a section of delicate blue sky broke free from the murk of the clouds above him, and he rose to his feet, and turning to the dark multitude of the dwellers, approached in little careful paces to the edge of the raft that faced the side of the lake where they were gathered. His back was turned to Barquentine, to the Countess his mother, and to all who stared, transfixed, at the only moving thing in the porcelain silence. Had a branch broken in any one of the 1,000 trees that surrounded the water, or had a cone fallen from a pine, the excruciating tension would have snapped. Not a branch broke. Not a cone fell. In the arms of the woman by the shore, the strange child she held began to struggle with a strength that she could not understand. It had reached outward from her breast, outward over the lake, and as it did so, the sky began to blossom in azure, and Titus, at the edge of the raft, tore at his necklace with such force that he found it loose in his hands. Then he lifted his head, and his single cry froze the multitude that watched him on every side, for it was neither a cry of tears nor of joy, nor was it fear or even pain. It was a cry that for all its shrillness was unlike the voice of a child, and as he cried he swung the necklace across the sparkling water, and as it sank a rainbow curved over Gormenghast, and a voice answered him, a tiny voice. In the absolute stillness it filled the universe, a cry like the single note of a bird. It floated over the water from the dwellers, from where the woman stood apart from her kind, from the throat of the little child of Kedda's womb, the bastard babe, and Titus's foster sister, lambent with ghost light.